The government says it wants to make it easier for Australians to buy a home. Its latest expansion of the 5% deposit scheme means almost anyone, regardless of income, can now buy a home with a fraction of the usual savings required for a deposit. It's the boldest version yet of a policy first introduced under the Morrison government. But behind the promise of affordability is a political calculation. There are far more votes to be won from rising house prices than from cheaper homes. Today, leading economist Saul Eslake on Labor's home buying scheme, why similar policies have failed in the past and what it would really take to fix the housing crisis. It's Wednesday, October 8.
From today, more young Australians will be able to get the keys to their first home quicker. And instead of paying off someone else's mortgage, they'll be paying off a home of their own.
So Labor's expanding Scott Morrison's 5% deposit scheme where the government backs you to buy a house with a smaller deposit than you would usually need. So how are they actually broadening who can get it?
Well, what the government's proposing is that there be no income test. Second, that the price caps that set maximum values of homes that can be purchased using the scheme will be significantly increased to, for example, 1.5 million in Sydney and 1 million in Brisbane, down to, say, $600,000 in Hobart. And thirdly, that there will be no cap on the number of people who can take up the scheme. So the government's intention is that a significantly larger proportion of first home buyers will be able to buy homes with deposits of as little as 5%.
3 months, because we're absolutely determined to do everything we can to fast-track home ownership, fast-track improved number of rentals, fast-track social ownership.
And obviously this plan is all about getting more Australians into the housing market. Given you'll need less money to get in, it will make it easier. So if that's the goal, then will it be a success?
Well, if it actually happens, then the answer would be yes. But while people will be able to access mortgage finance with smaller deposits than previously, the criteria that banks apply in determining to whom they lend and how much they are willing to lend still apply. And those rules are typically something like a maximum on the value of the loan as a multiple of the borrower's income. And secondly, a ceiling on the proportion of the borrower's income that can be applied to debt service payments, that is, interest and repayments of principal. And the banks are also required by APRA, the bank regulator, to stress test their customers' capacity to absorb an increase in interest rates of 3 percentage points. Now, those rules still apply. What this scheme will therefore do, I think, is help those who arguably have the capacity to borrow anyway, to borrow more than they'd otherwise be able to, sooner than they might otherwise be able to, and thus get into home ownership quicker than they might otherwise have been able to do. That's why the government says that although on paper it might seem this is open to all comers, in practice the number of people who will be able to take it up is, likely to be somewhere between about 30 and 50,000 a year.
So it's basically fast-tracking people that would eventually be in a position to buy a house.
That's my interpretation of it. And what that means is that, like almost every other scheme that governments have come up with, ostensibly to assist first home buyers get into the property market, it has as its core enabling people to spend more on housing, whilst the supply of housing remains, as economists say, relatively inelastic, that is, unresponsive to changes in demand in the short term, then the inevitable result is going to be higher prices. Now, the government concedes that it will result in higher prices, but says, based on Treasury modelling, that the increase will be just 0.5% over a 5-year period.
But already 185,000 Australians have benefited from this scheme. with minimal impact on prices. Treasury did modelling. They suggest a very small increase.
Do you trust that number, that modelling that suggests it's a 0.5% increase?
That's a good question. It's important to note that Treasury's modelling is referring to the median priced house across Australia's capital cities, whereas, of course, the typical first home buyer does not buy the median priced house. He or she, they typically buy a property that is less than the median priced house, because the median price includes the houses bought by people who are trading up and investors and so on. So other analysis, including work done by Nick Gruen and Jean Tunney for the Insurance Council of Australia, who obviously aren't particularly happy about this scheme because it in effect is pushing them out of what has been an important business for some of their members. They argue that this scheme will push up the price of houses or apartments that typical first-home buyers buy by between 3.5% and 6.5% over a somewhat shorter period. And history would suggest, going back to the first homeowners grant scheme introduced by the Menzies government in 1964, that anything that allows Australians to spend more on housing than they'd be able to otherwise, as this scheme will enable some Australians to do, results in more expensive housing. And the result of more expensive housing is that fewer people can afford to own it.
As you've alluded to, Sol, there have been many schemes in the past to assist first home buyers. Can you walk me through what we've seen in the past and what impact they've had on the housing market?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence that Australia's home ownership rate peaked at the first census, that of 1966, after the introduction of the first homeowners grant scheme, or home savings grant scheme, as it was called by the Menzies government in 1964. And, perhaps as an interesting footnote to history, Bob Menzies promised that scheme at the 1963 election at the urging of the New South Wales Young Liberals, whose president at the time was John Howard. And of course, later on as Prime Minister, John Howard insisted, when the GST was introduced, that state governments give first home owners grants of $7,000 initially, including to purchases of established homes, even though established homes weren't subject to the GST. So John Howard, throughout his political career, was always a believer in schemes that have at their heart giving cash to would-be first home buyers so that they can spend more buying the home that they're going to buy. And the result of all of this has been that the overall home ownership rate has declined by about 6 percentage points between the 1966 census, when it peaked at 72%, and the 2021 census taken during the middle of COVID. That decline doesn't sound very much, but it conceals some enormous divergences in home ownership rates among age groups. And that's because the home ownership rate among people aged 65 and over hasn't changed very much over the last 55 years, but the proportion of the population who are 65 and over has increased enormously. The home ownership rate among people aged under 30 has fallen to where it was in 1947. The home ownership rate among people in their 40s has fallen back to where it was at the census of 1954. And the home ownership rate among people aged between 45 and 54, who are not exactly young by conventional standards, is back to where it was in the early 1960s. And overwhelmingly, the cause of this huge decline in home ownership rates among people under the age of, say, 50 is the result of a combination of policies that all three levels of government have pursued over the last 60 years, which have had the effect of restraining growth in the supply of housing and inflating the price of housing.
So why is that so? Why do politicians ultimately want house prices to keep rising?
Politicians of all stripes know that in any given year, there's only about 110,000 people who become first home buyers each year. And even if you assume that for everyone who succeeds, there's 5 or 6 who'd like to but can't, that's still fewer than 1 million votes for policies that would restrain or halt escalating house prices. Whereas politicians also know that at any point in time, there are 11 million Australians who own their own home, There are more than 2 million who own at least one investment property. And even though those two groups overlap a fair bit, that means probably 12 million votes for policies that would keep house prices going up, preferably at a faster rate than incomes or inflation, which is what's been happening over at least the last 30 years. So, on the one hand, fewer than 1 million votes for policies that might actually stop house prices going up, as opposed to 11 or 12 million for policies that would keep house prices going up. Even the dumbest of our politicians can, as the Americans say, do that math. And they do at every election and between every election, which is why you see politicians keep coming up with schemes whose ultimate effect is to keep house prices going up. And, I'll give both Mr. Albanese and Mr. Dutton, the previous opposition leader, credit for being honest enough to admit that during the recent election campaign. They both said in different ways that they want house prices to keep going up, even though the election was ostensibly about the cost of living, and the biggest component of the cost of living is the cost of housing. They didn't actually want to solve the problem because they know that a very large majority of Australians don't want the problem to be solved.
The government does say it's working on supply. They have a target of 1.2 million new homes by 2029. So how far do you think that will go to addressing the supply side of the equation?
Well, I certainly want to give the government credit for the attention it's paying to the importance of boosting supply. And they're certainly trying hard to meet the targets that they have set, including by giving the states more money for the construction of social and affordable housing. One of their election promises was to finance the construction of 100,000 new homes over, I think it was 5 years, for sale to first home buyers using, among other things, under or disutilised government land. And they're also offering the states what are in effect bribes to encourage them to reform their zoning and planning laws with a view to speeding up the construction of housing. So, that's all helpful to boosting the supply of housing, but it's difficult. And it would appear that the increase in housing supply is going to fall short of the government's targets. The governor of the Reserve Bank made that point specifically. So, as I say, I give the government credit for the efforts it's making to try and boost housing supply, but it is hard. And in the meantime, what they're doing is boosting the demand for housing. And the result of more expensive housing is that the people who already own it get richer, and the people who don't own it find it increasingly difficult to join that club.
Saul, you said most people don't want house prices to go down. So is it possible to solve the housing crisis without housing prices being impacted in some way?
Well, I don't think it is. And that's why ultimately I'm very pessimistic that the problem will ever be solved. It's not going to be solved until one or more of three groups of people my age become a majority of voters. And that is, first of all, people, baby boomers and the like, who are altruistically concerned at the diminishing chances of their own children or grandchildren becoming homeowners. Second, again, people around my age and older who are annoyed at having to be the bank of mum and dad or to go guarantor on their children's or grandchildren's loans when they'd rather use the money they have to fund their own retirement. Or thirdly, again, people my age who are sick and tired of their late 20 and 30-year-old kids still living at home, expecting their laundry done, their meals cooked, and a blind eye turned to whoever they bring to the breakfast table of a morning. And all of those groups are increasing. And I think, to be fair, the proportion of baby boomers who are genuinely concerned and dismayed at the difficulties their own children and their peers are facing becoming homeowners, but nonetheless, they're clearly a minority. So, politicians keep saying that they want house prices to keep going up because they know that that's what a majority of voters want. And you don't get yourself elected to government by telling a very large majority of voters that they can't have what they want.
Saul Eslake, thank you so much for your time.
That's a pleasure.